Hi guys. Back today we're looking at Romans chapter 8 verses 31 through 39. So Paul has been referencing the suffering promised to Christians on earth. He has taught us that it is part of our inheritance. He has taught that creation itself is waiting along with us for the freedom and perfection to come. So, in the final verses of Romans chapter 8, Paul reassures his readers of God's unending, impenetrable love. So, Paul asks, if God is for us, who can be against us, right? It's a rhetorical question. If God is the one who justifies us, then who can condemn us? If Jesus himself is interceding in prayer for us, who will separate us from the love of God? So in other words, it's going to be futile for those who oppose us, at least in the end. It may not seem that way here on earth, but in the end, it's going to be futile. All of the efforts of Satan to dissuade us from our faith, to separate us from God's love, that doesn't work, because God's love stays with us from the time that we're a believer moving forward. So, and the answers to all of Paul's questions here are obvious. Nothing and no one can separate us from God's love. Paul gives us a list of things that cannot separate us from God's love, which encompasses everything, but he does name a few just so that we're not confused. Not tribulation, not distress, not persecution, not famine, not nakedness, not danger, not the sword, not death, not life, not angels, not rulers, not the present, not the future, not powers. Nothing in all of creation, says Paul, can separate us from God's love. So, again, as I like to say, this is good news, right? But right smack dab in the middle of Paul's list of things that cannot separate us from God's love, Paul does bring up one sobering reality in the midst of all this good news. And it's kind of like the crux of the passage, if we're following along here. He cites Psalm 44:22, and it says this: "Yet for your sake we are killed all day long. We are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered." So why does Paul bring up this verse, and what is it even talking about? Psalm 44 was written at a time when God's people were experiencing extreme persecution, suffering here on earth, not because of their sin this time, but because of their faithfulness to him. So Paul wants us to get this. That's why he brings it up. This passage is all about this particular fact. Because following God, following Jesus in this world, God promises, as we've been saying the last couple passages, God promises as part of our inheritance as Jesus's offspring and his brothers and sisters that we will experience suffering just as he did. So it's a rite of passage as a Christian to experience persecution and suffering on earth. So Paul wants us to get this, because just because terrible things will and do happen to us on earth, as we know, it's not evidence that God is not with us. It's not proof that he's abandoned us, forgotten us, doesn't love us, or doesn't see us. Suffering and hardship for a believer is actually the opposite. It proves that we're like him, because no one suffered more than Jesus as an innocent, right? And we're not innocent. He was. So God is proving our faith by entrusting us with suffering. And we can look at the story of Job in the Old Testament, and we can see this because, you know, the Bible talks about how righteous Job was. If there was a righteous man on earth, it was Job, right? As much as a human can be righteous in following God, Job was it. But he experienced such severe suffering, but God was proving in him his faith. Okay, so just as Jesus endured faithfully, as Job endured faithfully, so will we, his people. So the good news is that none of it can separate us from the love of God, no matter what happens to us, no matter how bad it is. And now this passage makes sense because, like, if you don't have any hardship or any trials or any suffering, then why would you be thinking about being abandoned by God or not, or being separated from God's love? Because that is the natural human tendency for us, is to think that God doesn't care, right? I've been there lots of times. Like, it is a real test of your faith when things happen that you never would have dreamed. Like, you look back on your life and you say, how can this be my life? This isn't what I planned. This isn't what I was seeing in the future when I thought about what my life would be. But nevertheless, God entrusts us with suffering. And a lot of times it's things that we never would have expected. We never would have thought would happen to us. So be careful when you say that will never happen to me, because it just might. Not wishing that on anybody. But anyway, but now the passage makes sense. It doesn't make sense apart from having suffering, because we're not afraid to be separated from God when everything's great. We think, oh, sure, I have God's favor, right? He likes me best, right? But that's not how it feels when you're suffering. So God will always be with us in the worst of times. That's what Paul wants us to get. Even if it doesn't seem like he's there, he's there. And what did Job say? He just wanted a hearing with God. He's like, where are you? I can't find you, right? I don't understand any of these things that are happening to me. And finally, when he gets a hearing with God and God speaks with him, all he can do is bow his head and get on his knees. And God says what? He doesn't give him an explanation for the suffering. He just says, were you there when I put the stars out? Were you there when I put the oceans in place? Like, where were you? So, like, God's saying, I'm God and I know what's best for my children. And I am going to refine you to a place where I want you to be. When you get to glory, you're going to understand. But right now, you don't. You're finite. I'm infinite. So trust me. That's what God's saying. Trust me. And it's a real testament to your faith when you can trust God, even though the worst of the worst is happening in your life. So right here, Paul's given us the good news that no matter what happens, no matter how bad it is, God is going to be with us. He will always be with us. Nothing can separate us from his love. No one can overpower our salvation that he's already given to us. And he's just going to be walking with us no matter what happens to us. And so we need to remember that, because so many hard things happen in life, right? And it's easy for us to doubt God. So God never promised an easy life. I wish he had. I wish it was different. But God never promised an easy life to his people. And we need to remember that. He promised that we would suffer, as Jesus did, as part of our inheritance, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us here on earth, but I think it will make sense when we get there. He also, though, the good news is he promised to be with us no matter how bad it is or what happens to us. So keep that in mind. That's all I have for today. I hope it's helpful. And send me questions, comments, whatever you want. See you later.